This week on Forward.
We now have a new type of weight loss drug working in a completely new way that causes people, depending on which drug you're using, to lose an average of between 15 and 24% of their body weight within a year. From interviewing the leading neuroscientists on this, we now know actually the evidence is increasingly clear that these drugs work primarily on your brain. Actually, I think a really basic drawback is that lots of people just lose their pleasure in eating food. And eating is a very basic joy in life, right?
I'm Asian, man. Yeah, you take that away. The Asians will be like, I'm out. It is my pleasure to welcome back to the podcast New York Times bestselling author and author of the phenomenal new book, Magic Pill, The Extraordinary Benefits and Disturbing Risks of the New Weight Loss Drugs, and a user himself, Johann Hari. Welcome, Johann.
A user himself, it sounds weirdly sinister. Hey, Andrew, great to be with you.
Doesn't it, though? So your last book was about how social media and modern technology are crushing our attention, which I agree totally. Others are now coming in right behind you on that. But I have to say, I was pumped to interview you and read this book because Ozempic, like, what the heck is going on? You know, so I ran into a friend and he looked great. And I said, you look great. And he said, oh, yeah, I'm on Ozempic. And he looked great because he had dropped probably 20 pounds. And I loved how just completely upfront he was about it. Now, this was not a celebrity type. This is just like a guy who works in business in New York. But his cavalier attitude about it made me think, wow, everyone who uses this drug is totally comfortable sharing, and it's more widespread than I had thought. So first, how many people are using this drug, and how normal was the guy, my friend, that I talked to over dinner?
47% of Americans say they want to use this drug in the most recent polling. We don't have good figures because so many people are using compounded versions, so sort of the equivalent of a fake, Louis Vuitton handbag or something. Loads of people are getting compounded versions. But I felt exactly that strange, Ozempic, what the heck is going on, could have been the alternative subtitle of the book. I'll never forget the exact moment I learned about the existence of these drugs, because I don't remember ever feeling so conflicted about a topic so quickly. It was the winter of 2022, and it was that moment when the world was finally opening up again. And I got invited to a party that was thrown by an Oscar-winning actor. I'm not saying that just to name drop, it's relevant. And in the Uber on the way there, I was feeling a bit kind of self-conscious because I had gained loads of weight during lockdown, and I was actually quite fat at the start. I'd gained quite a lot of weight during lockdown. And I kind of thought, I felt a bit schlubby. And then I suddenly thought, wow, actually, most people I know who have gained weight during the lockdown, it's going to be fascinating seeing these like Hollywood types with a bit of like extra podge on them, right? And I arrived at the party and I was walking around and it was bizarre. It's not just that they hadn't gained weight, they were gaunt. Like everyone was visibly thinner. They looked like their own Snapchat filter, like kind of cleaner and clearer and sharper. And I bumped into a friend of mine on the dance floor and I said, wow, it looks like everyone really did take up Pilates during lockdown. And she laughed at me and I had no idea why she was laughing. I must have done a puzzled face. And she pulled up on her phone an Ozempic pen. I had never seen one before. And obviously then in the days that followed, I learned we now have a new type of weight loss drug working in a completely new way that causes people, depending on which drug you're using, to lose an average of between 15 and 24% of their body weight within a year. And I remember immediately thinking, well, okay, I can see the benefits here, right? I'm older now than my grandfather ever got to be because he died of a heart attack when he was 44 years old. Loads of the men in my family get fat and get heart disease. My dad had serious heart problems. My uncle died of a heart attack. And I thought, well, I knew even then that obesity caused an extraordinary array of illnesses. In fact, it contributes to over 200 known diseases and complications. So I thought, well, if there's a drug that really can reverse or reduce that, that's going to have a big effect on health. But I also thought, hang on a minute, I've been here before. Every 20 years or so, a new miracle weight loss drug is announced. People stampede to take it. We always discover it has some horrendous side effect that means they have to
Sure.
withdraw it from the market.
Yeah.
I thought, can you really have such a thing as a free lunch? I guess with Ozempic, it would be a smaller free lunch, but can you really get that when it comes to something as complex as the human body? So to try to understand this, I went on this big journey all over the world, from Iceland to Minneapolis to Tokyo, to interview, over 100 of the leading experts and people who've been affected by this, the biggest critics of the drugs, the biggest defenders of the drugs. I took it myself. And it's a kind of weird thing, Andrew, and a bit different to the book we talked about before, in that I know much more than I knew at the start about the benefits of these drugs, about the 12 big risks, about what they're going to do to the culture and the economy, which is huge. But at the end of all that, it's a bit disconcerting. I'm still quite torn about it. I'm still quite divided. Anyone whose attitude is either, yay, these drugs will save us all, or boo, these drugs are demonic, I think is missing the much more interesting and complex situation, which is that there's a lot of complexity and ambiguity here.
Well, so the first thing for the layperson, how the heck does this drug work? It just makes you less hungry, right? Which does sound like a more benign way to go about helping someone lose weight. Like folks who, and you said there are different mechanisms for different drugs.
One of the really disconcerting things is we actually don't fully understand how it works. There's a few things we know for sure. If you ate something now, Andrew, it doesn't matter what it is, bagel, KFC, anything, after a little while, your pancreas would produce a hormone called GLP-1. And we now know that GLP-1 is part of your body's natural brakes. It's basically your body's signal going, hey, Andrew, you've had enough now, stop eating. But natural GLP-1, once it's created, only stays in your system for a few minutes and then it's washed away. So what these drugs do is they inject into you an artificial copy of GLP-1 that, instead of lasting for a few minutes, lasts for a whole week, which has this weird effect. I'll never forget the second day I took Ozempic, waking up and lying there in bed and thinking, oh, I feel something really strange. What is it? And I couldn't locate in my body what it was. And then I realized I had woken up and I wasn't hungry. Every day previous to that, I would be woken up by this raging hunger. And I went to this diner up the street from where I live, and I went in and I ordered the thing I used to order every morning, which was a big brown roll with loads of chicken and loads of mayo. And the woman brought it to me, and I had like 4 mouthfuls and I was just full. I couldn't eat the rest. And that's basically what happened to me from then on. So it was initially thought, because GLP-1 is created in your gut, that the effect was primarily on your gut, that maybe it slowed gastric emptying, something like that. And there are certainly effects on the gut. But from interviewing the leading neuroscientists on this, we now know actually the evidence is increasingly clear that these drugs work primarily on your brain. They
Wow.
change your brain in ways that we don't fully understand. And it's slightly disconcerting. There's lots of different theories about what it does to your brain, which brings up a whole different set of benefits and risks.
So don't take this the wrong way, but you look great. And
How dare you? I'm hanging up.
and when I say that, like the natural thought for me, it was like, wow, like Johann's referencing these weight problems. Are you still on one of these drugs? Because you sure look like $1,000,000.
So I decided to carry on taking them because, for me, and I stress I do not believe this is the case for everyone, for me the benefits that we know outweigh the risks that we know. But I'm conscious that I could come to regret that, because many of the risks may turn out to be worse than we think. So if you want to think about the benefits of these drugs, I think it actually helps to think about a parallel area of science. So think about bariatric surgery. Up to now, it's been extremely hard to lose a huge amount of weight and keep it off for the long term. Some people do it just through calorie restriction and exercise. We all know someone like that. Someone very close to me in my family did that. But that's actually surprisingly unusual when you look at the stats. So up to now, the most reliable and easy to study way has been bariatric surgery, things like, stomach stapling, that kind of thing. And what we know about bariatric surgery is it's a horrific, grueling operation. 1 in 1,000 people die during the operation. But the reason
Terrible.
people do it, awful, the reason people do it is because of what happens when you reverse obesity or hugely reduce it. So if you have bariatric surgery, in the 7 years that follow, you are 56% less likely to die of a heart attack. You are 60% less likely to die of cancer. You are 92% less likely to die of diabetes-related causes. In fact, it's so good for your health, you're 40% less likely to die of any cause at all. And we know that with these drugs, although bear in mind with bariatric surgery, you're starting from quite serious obesity, otherwise you wouldn't qualify for the operation. We know that with these drugs, they're moving people in a similar direction. So if you take these drugs and you have a BMI higher than 27, you on average will have a 20% lower risk of having a heart attack in the next 2 years and a 20% lower chance of having a stroke. So for me, with my family's heart history, that was the thing that really decided it for me. But a lot of the big risks that I warn about don't apply to me, but do apply to lots of other people. So it's a very and I did have some rocky moments taking these drugs and some real setbacks as well. So it hasn't been an easy decision for me.
Hey YouTube, thanks for watching. Please do hit like and subscribe and hit that bell if you want to be notified every time a new episode drops. Probably on Mondays, but hit that bell, and thank you. So I'm going to relate my breakfast story to you. So I decided to start intermittent fasting beginning of this year, which I had dabbled with earlier. And so I try not to eat breakfast. And then the first couple of weeks, you wake up and your stomach's grumbling and you feel a little groggy, and you could really use like a muffin or a juice or coffee or whatever it was. But then after about 2 weeks, that feeling starts to change. At least it did for me. And then there would be a lot of times where I would go to eat something, and then I would think to myself, like, wait a minute, am I actually hungry? There's like your body starts getting to a point where you're not hungry as much, or at least this has been the case for me. And you realize how much of our eating is habitual rather than called for by some kind of biological impulse. I'm in the proportion of people that, frankly, the first thing I would do would be that kind of measure, and then I would try. So you don't eat early, don't eat late, and I'd try and exercise more regularly, and I'd try and avoid fried food and sweets. Though it's tough for me because I really like sweets. That's like the set of measures. I will also say, for someone like me, like I would not consider using one of these drugs just based on my health profile, and the natural human impulse you have is that it's too good to be true, which you go through. And it's good that someone like you actually went around documenting the risks. So when you talked about some of your rockier days and then the risks that both apply to you or don't apply to you, what are we talking about?
Well, one of them that comes to mind straight away is actually that relates to what you were just saying about your own experience of intermittent fasting. If you'd asked me, a year and a half ago when I wasn't using these drugs, Johann, why do you eat? I would have said, well, dummy, I eat because I'm hungry, because my body needs sustenance, right? And I would have been vaguely aware there were other drivers of my eating, but, I would have thought that was by far the biggest driver. Here I am now. I used to eat 3,200 calories a day, roughly. I now eat 1,800, roughly. And my body is alive and well. In fact, it's healthier than it was. So something was accounting for all that other eating. You're right. Part of it is habit. I think there's other significant drivers. I think there's strong evidence that the kind of food we eat, particularly in the United States, is massively driving us to overeat. Remind me to come back to that. But in terms of the psychological drivers, I had a real epiphany about this, actually. So some doctors have been worried that people taking these drugs, a minority, I want to stress it's a minority if it's happening at all, appear to be becoming depressed or even becoming suicidal. And that didn't happen to me, but I did feel, the first 6 months I was taking the drugs, my friend Danielle was pregnant, and every time I would run into her, I'd be like, hey, we're going in opposite directions. She was swelling and I was shrinking. But I remember saying to her one day, about 6 months in, this is really weird, right? I'm getting what I wanted. I'm losing loads of weight, but I don't actually feel better. If anything, I felt slightly worse. I certainly wasn't depressed, but I felt kind of muted. So I think, why would that be? And I had an epiphany about this in Las Vegas. All great epiphanies begin in Las Vegas. I was, as you know, I'm writing a book about a series of crimes that have been happening in Vegas. I've been writing it for ages. And I was researching the murder of someone that I knew and loved. And it's obviously a very painful thing to do. And really on autopilot, I went to a KFC. It's the branch on West Sahara for people in Vegas. And it's one of the skeeziest KFCs in the whole world. I love it. And I ordered what I would have ordered a year before. I ordered a bucket of fried chicken. I felt terrible, and I sat there and I had a chicken drumstick, right? And I suddenly realized, shit, I can't eat this, right? I can't eat it. And I suddenly, it's almost like a voice in my head said, you're just going to have to feel bad, right? And it's funny, Colonel Sanders was on the wall, and I felt like he was looking at me saying, hey, what happened to my best customer, right? But I realized one of the things they don't tell you about these drugs, there's many things I go through in the book that I think people really need to know if they're thinking of starting, is because these drugs interrupt your eating patterns, they often bring to the surface the deep underlying psychological drivers of your eating all along. So in my case, I grew up in a very chaotic family. There was a lot of addiction and kind of craziness. And I realized I grew up eating primarily to calm myself down, stuffing myself to calm myself down, to like numb myself, right? This is very common. If you look at the day after Trump was elected, sales of tacos and donuts on in New York City like went up by a factor, I think 1,000%, right? We all do it sometimes.
That's why they call it comfort food.
Exactly. We all do it to some degree, and you basically can't comfort eat when you're on these drugs. If I tried to eat that bucket of fried chicken, I would have vomited, right? You can't do it. So that can be a good thing. It can bring those emotions to the surface where you can find a better way to deal with them than, drowning them in saturated fats. But it's a painful transition when you suddenly have to become aware of those feelings. I mean, there are other people who argue that actually that theory is wrong or only offers a narrow explanation. There are other people who argue actually the reason people are becoming depressed is because of the brain effects. So we don't know what it's doing to the brain, but one theory, which I stress is one theory among several, is that these drugs work by dampening your reward system. That I don't want to eat the Big Mac because the Big Mac is actually less rewarding to me than it used to be. Now, that obviously raises the possibility, if it's dampening my reward system for, a Big Mac, for a bucket of fried chicken, could it be dampening my reward system for, say, work or sex or other things? We do know some people seem to be becoming depressed. We do know some people seem to be losing their interest in sex or their ability to have sex. Fortunately, neither of those things happen to me, but you begin to see potentially there may be other things going on here.
Hey all, if you know me, you know I'm not that handy in the kitchen, and I have become a huge believer and booster of Factor. Factor's delicious, ready-to-eat meals make eating a joy. It's so fast, you just pop that thing 2 minutes later, and you are eating a restaurant-quality, healthy meal, making you feel excellent about yourself. My favorite is the turkey chili with zucchini, and there is so much more to choose from. You never get tired of it. It fits any budget. It's fast, healthy. It is going to be the new Factor in your life. Yes, I'm a fan. Head to factormeals.com/yang50 and use code yang50 to get 50% off your first box and 2 free wellness shots per box while subscription is active. That's code yang50 at factormeals.com/yang50 to get 50% off your first box. Get Factor today. It's going to change the way you eat. Yeah, so when I was young, and it's funny when we talk about comfort food, I'll relate again my personal experiences because it might be interesting to people. So I was a very skinny kid and then a skinny teenager. So I vividly remember going to diners and ordering double bacon cheeseburgers because I was trying to gain any weight, and the weight would just leave my frame very quickly. I started working out when I was 17 or so, going to college, and then I would drink protein shakes. I would try and add muscle mass. I actually just found out that I might have some like very, very mild musculoskeletal variants because I probably lifted too heavy weights when I was when I was young. But for me, my relationship with food was, hey, like let's try and add mass, and to the extent I had a release when I was depressed about a relationship or something like that, it was the gym. And what's funny is that I'm pretty sure that most of us have some kind of reaction to negative emotion And in many ways, it depends upon whether that reaction is considered healthy or unhealthy. I mean, certainly, I think a lot of people might run, and we
Mm,
consider that very healthy. A lot of people might eat, and we consider that not so good. And so it's interesting to think about if you were to take away someone's mechanism of comfort. Another food experience I had was that when I was running for president, I would eat crap all the time, and it was very hard not to because you would just be stressed out all the time, and then
mm.
you'd be in a car, and then what are you going to do in the car? I mean, what are you going to have for lunch? What's around you? I mean, it's pretty much fast food. Or we'd stop at a rest stop, and you'd have. So I tried to get nuts and something not so bad, but then right next to the nuts are the chips and the cookies. So,
And that's
you
so significant, Andrew. That thing about that key question you're asking, it's so revealing. It's so fascinating. It's on a presidential campaign as well, because what's around us, right? The evidence is overwhelming that we live in what's called an obesogenic environment, an environment that pushes us towards obesity. And what I found fascinating, for a long time, I was researching what I thought of as two different questions that only joined at the end. One was, we're pretty much the same age. When we were born, obesity was really quite rare. In the United States, around 11% of people were obese, right? So quite rare. Between the year I was born and the year I turned 21, obesity doubled in the United States. And then in the next 20 years, severe obesity doubled again. It has blown up to levels that are unprecedented in all of human history. You basically have 300,000 years of obesity being very rare. And then, literally in our lifetimes, a majority of Americans are obese or overweight. If you want to get a sense of how weird this is, just everyone should just pause this podcast and Google photographs of beaches in the United States in, say, 1975. They look really weird to us because everyone pretty much is what we would think of as skinny, right? Or jacked. And you look at it and go, well, where was everyone else that day, right? Was it a skinny person convention on that beach? No. That, you look at the population figures, that is what Americans look like. The average American now weighs more than 30 pounds more than the average American weighed in 1960, right? So what happened? I was looking at that. Why did obesity blow up so much? And I was also looking at how do these drugs work? And I thought they would join at the end because obviously the rise in obesity creates the demand for the drugs. But actually, the same word kept coming up in both investigations. It's a word we don't use that often in English, but most of us know what it means. Satiety. When you feel sated, when you've just had enough and you don't want any more. And we all know that sensation from some point in our lives, right? It turns out there is very strong evidence that the kind of food we eat is profoundly undermining our satiety, our ability to know when to stop. Obesity has risen everywhere in the world that makes one change and one change only. It's not a collapse in willpower, it's not, a rise in greed. It's where most people move from eating diets that are predominantly whole foods that are prepared on the day to eating predominantly foods that are constructed out of chemicals in factories in a process that isn't even called cooking, it's called manufacturing food. And that food, which would be unrecognizable to all the humans who came before us, affects our bodies in a profoundly different way. And there's lots of evidence for this. I go through the 7 ways in which this kind of ultra processed food makes us overeat. But there's an experiment that to me just absolutely distilled it. That was done by a brilliant scientist called Professor Paul Kenny, who's at Mount Sinai in New York. He's the head of neuroscience there. And he grew up in Dublin in Ireland. And when he was in his 20s, he moved to San Diego and he quickly clocked, oh, Americans don't eat like Irish people did at the time, right? Much more processed and ultra processed food, junk food, sugary food. And like many an immigrant, he quickly assimilated. And within a year, he gained more than 30 pounds. And he started to feel like this food he was eating was not just changing his gut, but changing his brain and what he desired. So he did this experiment to test it, which I have nicknamed Cheesecake Park. It's very simple. He got a load of rats and he raised them in a cage. And all they had to eat was the kind of food they evolved to eat over thousands of years, natural food. And it turns out when they ate that natural food, they had some kind of innate nutritional wisdom. They would eat when they were hungry and then they would just stop, right? They never became fat or overweight or obese. Then Professor Kenny introduced them to the American diet. He fried up some bacon, he bought a load of Snickers bars, he bought some cheesecake, and he put it down alongside the healthy food. And the rats went crazy for the American diet. They would literally dive into the cheesecake and eat their way out, just completely slicked with cheesecake. They would eat and eat and eat and eat, and all that nutritional wisdom that they'd had telling them to stop when they had the old food that they knew and understood just went out the window. And as Professor Kenny put it to me, within a couple of days they were different animals, and they became very severely overweight. Incredibly, he then tweaked the experiment again in a way that feels a little bit cruel to me as a former junk food addict. He took away the American diet and left them with nothing but the food they'd grown up with, the healthy food. And he thought he knew what would happen, that they would eat more of the healthy food then than they had in the past. And this would prove that processed food expands the number of calories you eat in a day. That is not what happened. Something much weirder happened. Once they'd had the American food and it was taken away, they refused to eat the healthy food at all. It was like they no longer recognized it as food. It was only when they were literally starving that they went back to it. Now, there's lots of evidence this is happening to us. The food we eat is completely scrambles our evolutionary instincts, completely undermines our satiety and leads us to overeat. But that word satiety also kept coming up when I talked to people about how the drugs work. What the drugs do is they give you back your satiety. In fact, one of the scientists who designed them describes what they give you as satiety hormones. But when you see it that way, you begin to realize, as one of the professors, Michael Lowe, put it to me, this is an artificial solution to an artificial problem, right? Processed and ultra processed food created this hole, this tremendous hunger, and then the drugs come and fill it in this complex and risky way.
I brought my kid to a McDonald's yesterday, and that was like a treat for me and my brother when we were growing up. And one of the things that continues to blow my mind is how inexpensive McDonald's remains.
Mm,
If
yes.
you look at the prices compared to when I was a kid, they're not that different.
Mm,
And so the sense of things is have processed foods are cheap, they keep well, you can get them out to people. There's a sense that we've now distributed them incredibly broadly. And if you are cost sensitive, then they become the go to. And now we need drugs to give us back something that was taken away from us by uh, the changes that we've kind of imposed on certainly poor people
mm.
with their diet. So one thing I don't know the answer to, and I'd like your help with, is Ozempic covered by health insurance or no? Like if I'm a normal American who doesn't have like morbid obesity, but I kind of want to lose 20 pounds. Like, are these drugs available to me easily? You said
Mm.
before 47% of Americans kind of want them. But what is the cost and accessibility?
Yeah, most Americans can't get these drugs, even people who have a desperate physical need. So, for example, I interviewed a woman called Deborah Tyler, who's a nurse in Connecticut, whose daughter was very severely obese. And at the age of 8 was starting to have liver problems. I mean, really very serious situation. Deborah managed to get Ozempic for her daughter. Her daughter started to recover. All her lipids were going in the right direction. She was much better. And then her healthcare plan threw her daughter off of it, which is happening to most people. In fact, her daughter wouldn't even get on that plan now.
Well,
Um,
and to the extent that if I just rolled in and said, "Hey, insurance aside, I'm just going to buy it," like what
yeah,
what's the price tag?
it's about $1,000 a month. By the way, it's as you know, I live half the time in the US, half the time in Britain, and um, in Vegas, I pay about $1,000 a month for a compounded version. Here in Britain, I pay £200 a month, which is what, $280, something like that. So, as with every drug, you're being constantly ripped off, right? Your old friend Bernie Sanders was absolutely right on that one. It's staggering to me every time I have to buy any kind of drug in the United States, the degree to which the political system has been rigged to allow drug companies to just absolutely bilk Americans. It is unbelievable and infuriating. Um, so there are lots of scenarios with these drugs that I go through in the book. I mean, ranging from super pessimistic, this could turn out to be like fen-phen, which was a diet drug in the 90s that was marketed in exactly the way Ozempic was. Literally, the front page of Time magazine was the new miracle weight loss drug. 18 million prescriptions for fen-phen were written in 1995. It worked incredibly well for weight loss. It also gave people primary pulmonary hypertension, a horrific lung disease that means you have to be on oxygen for the rest of your life if you don't actually die. It had to be withdrawn from the market. It led to the biggest payout in the history of the pharmaceutical industry, $12 billion. I don't rule out that something like that could happen here. I think it's unlikely, but there are some red flashing lights that we should be concerned about. So we go all the way from the most pessimistic scenario like that to the most optimistic scenario, which is that the drugs work, that the benefits outweigh the costs, that we don't discover very concerning long-term risks, and crucially, that we get them to everyone who needs them. And that they wake us up to ask, how the hell did we get into this situation? And they lead us to deal with the underlying problem in the food supply. I went to countries that have done that, like Japan. We can talk about that. But I think that beat about everyone who gets them wants them. So we're going to have a rough 8 years ahead of us. In 8 years' time, Ozempic goes out of patent. At which point, it's not inherently expensive to make these drugs. It costs about $40 a month, right? So 8 years from now, it'll be a daily pill, barring some disastrous side effect being, or the already worrying side effects turning out to be worse than we think. It'll be a pill for a little bit more than $1 a day. It'll be pills by then. The pills already exist, but it'll be overwhelmingly pills by then. My guess is that at that point, you will have about 47% of Americans taking it. Between now and then, you can well imagine a dystopian scenario where what we basically have, which is the Real Housewives of New Jersey get to be super skinny while the real school children of New Jersey get to get diabetes at the age of 12, right?
This podcast is sponsored by Helix Sleep. I've always been a mattress guy because I figured if I'm going to do something for up to 8 hours, maybe I should do it right. And Helix Sleep lets you do it right by sending you one of 20 unique mattresses that's tailored for you. I took the Helix Sleep quiz, takes only a couple minutes, and I was matched with a Helix Dawn mattress because I wanted something that felt firm and I sleep on my back. That mattress is exactly what I needed, but strangely enough, my kids now seek out that mattress in the house and want to sleep on it even though I did not order it with them in mind. If you have a high quality mattress, it is a game changer, a huge difference maker. Don't take my word for it. Helix has been awarded the #1 mattress picked by GQ and Wired magazine. It is even recommended by multiple leading chiropractors and doctors of sleep medicine as a go-to solution for improving your sleep. Helix is offering up to 30% off all mattress orders and 2 free pillows for our listeners. Go to helixsleep.com/yang. That's helixsleep.com/yang. This is their best offer yet, and it won't last long. With Helix, better sleep starts now. Let's talk about kids for a second. Kids can or cannot take Ozempic. Is that like they're like a safety thing? Because we all know child obesity is a problem, but the prospect of kids taking Ozempic seems really messed up to me. But is there right now like a cutoff?
Loads of kids are taking the drug now. It's going up and up. Novo Nordisk is currently doing a trial of giving it to 6-year-olds. And like you, I viscerally recoil, although I have enormous sympathy for the parents in this position. And actually, of all the times I did research for the book, this was the time when I got really angry. Not with the parents at all, who were faced with an intolerable situation. Deborah Tyler, the woman I just mentioned, is a wonderful person and a loving, caring mother. And I think she probably did make the right decision for her child in that situation. What enrages me is, I went to Japan. There is almost literally no childhood obesity in Japan. There's almost no obesity in Japan. 42.5% of Americans are obese. 4% of Japanese people are obese, and it's falling.
And half of them are sumo wrestlers.
It's kind of weird that we expect Japanese people to look like sumo wrestlers. It's a bit like expecting an American to look like a bald eagle, right? There's just such a freakish exception. Yeah, there's basically sumo wrestlers and everyone else, right? And they did that because they did not allow the processed food industry to poison and fuck up their children, right? That's basically it. And go through other reasons as well. I spent a lot of time in Japan researching this. I can explain how we could do that in the US.
Well, I just want to make a quick comment. When you're in Japan and you eat food, it's food. You know what I mean?
That's a very good point. They actually eat
like, oh yeah, like what we think of as Japanese food, that's just what they eat. Like, you go inside, that's like,
Well, especially, and you compare that to 78% of the calories an average American child eats in a day are ultra processed food, right? Which means it was built in a
wow.
factory out of chemicals and your grandparents wouldn't have recognized it as food. And you think more 3-year-old children in the United States know what the McDonald's M means than know their own last name. So we've got a situation where kids are, from the moment they're born, pumped full of signals. And I quote in the book a leaked memo from one of the food companies that says, you've got to get kids early. You shape them early, you get them for life, right? That's why they deliberately give this food free to schools. It's why they deliberately, use children's cartoon characters, etc., etc., etc. Right? So, firstly, we should not be tolerating that. It's outrageous. It was done to me. It's done to most American kids. It's completely wrong. There are loads of countries that don't permit it. Once that trap has been created, you're left in a very difficult position, right? Of course, you should try diet and exercise first. That you won't find an obese person who hasn't tried dieting and exercise. It'll be very hard to find one. You should try it. It's definitely worth trying. There is a minority of people for whom it works. I can explain more about why actually it doesn't work for most people. But the key thing is for kids. With kids, you activate the most worrying of all the 12 risks that I write about in Magic Pill, from my perspective, which is we have no idea about the long-term effects of these drugs, right? So when you talk about safety, a lot of scientists say, and it's a good point, and these are good scientists making a reasonable point, actually, we've got loads of data. Diabetics have been taking these drugs for 18 years now. And they're right. For people who don't know, in addition to having this effect on appetite, these drugs also stimulate the creation of insulin, which is what both type 1 and type 2 diabetics are lacking. It's why it's a diabetes medication. And they've been taking it for 18 years now. So to put it crudely, they kind of go, well, look, if it gave you horns, the diabetics would have grown horns by now, right? And that's a good point. Although other people have said, well, if we're going to base our confidence in the safety of these drugs on the diabetics, let's actually dig into the diabetics. There are some worrying signs there, but I can come back to that. But to me, the most worrying thing is beyond that 18-year horizon, we've got no idea at all. And there's an analogy that was explained to me by Dr. Greg Stanwood, one of the scientists researching these drugs at Florida State. He stressed he doesn't think this is likely, and he stressed this as an analogy. But think about in the 1950s, scientists started giving antipsychotics to people, and they judged, based on the best evidence at the time, that the benefits outweighed the risks. 40, 50 years later, it was discovered if you take these drugs for year after year after year, you are much more likely to get Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia, like a really significant increase.
Awful.
Now, there's no way you could have known that at the start in
Sure.
the 1950s, right? You had to have people taking it for 50 years or 40 or 50 years before that effect showed up. Now, similarly, what we know about these drugs is they are chronically activating key brain regions. If you give these drugs to rats and then you cut open their brain, which obviously we can't do with humans, what you see is it goes to every part of the brain, and it's activating, parts of the brain that relate to memory processing, taste processing, gut motility, really essential parts of the brain. Obviously, that's worrying for me. I'm 45. If I take it, I'm going to be taking it for 40 years. But if you're giving it to an 8-year-old, what we're saying is they would potentially be taking this for 80 years, right?
And presumably their system would be more sensitive to it in those early years before they're physically mature,
That's absolutely
presumably.
true. And there's all sorts of ways in which their system would be more sensitive to it. Dan Cooper, who's a professor at UC Irvine of pediatric medicine, has pointed out, children use calories differently to adults. They're not just miniature adults. They use them differently to us. For example, they need calories for bone mineralization. So there's a risk that if they're taking too high a dose of these drugs, or even a standard dose, that it may weaken their bones. Now, with all of the risks, I want to stress, you obviously prevent obesity if you can, reverse it through diet and exercise if you can. But if you can't, then you're faced with two very difficult choices: taking the risks of these drugs or taking the risk of obesity. And I have to be honest, the thing that most surprised me in the research for the book, I'm embarrassed to say this, is something I thought I'd known since I was a little kid, which is just how bad for your health obesity is, right? At any point since I was like 5, I guess if you'd said to me, well, is being really overweight bad for you? I would have said, well, yes. But when you dig into the research, I think we really euphemize it actually. Think about diabetes, for example, right? So I guess I've known since I was a kid that diabetes makes it much more likely you get, obesity makes it much more likely you get diabetes. If you look at the figures, if you're obese when you're 18, you have a 70% chance of getting diabetes in your life, right? But I thought, okay, as long as you've got good health insurance and you get insulin, you're basically like everyone else, right? You're like everyone else. That isn't true at all. Diabetes knocks 15 years off your life and makes it much more likely that you will be catastrophically unwell in the lead up to your death. It's the biggest cause of preventable blindness in the United States. More people have to have a limb amputated or an extremity because of diabetes in the US every year than because they got shot. And we all notice a lot of us get shot. Um, I interviewed a doctor who treats diabetics, a very prominent doctor in Britain called Dr. Max Pemberton. He said to me, if you gave me a choice between becoming diabetic and becoming HIV positive, I would choose to become HIV positive every day of the
Wow.
week
I
because
mean,
if,
no one
if
would
you're
think that.
exactly if you're HIV positive and you get treatment, you live as long as everyone else and you don't get sick in the last years of your life more than anyone else. With diabetes, that is absolutely not the case. And diabetes is just one of an extraordinary array of illnesses. 200 known diseases and complications are made more likely by obesity. We absolutely need to oppose stigma, which is a form of cruelty and bullying, but we also need to tell the truth about the actual health risks of obesity. And so you need to, when we're talking about the long-term risks, Dr. Shauna Levy, a very wise obesity specialist at Tulane School of Medicine in New Orleans, said to me, we don't know the long-term risks of these drugs. We do know the long-term risks of obesity, and they are really serious.
This podcast is sponsored by ExpressVPN. A few decades ago, private citizens used to be largely that. Private. What's changed? The internet. Think about everything you browsed, searched for, watched, or tweeted. Now imagine all of that data being crawled through, collected, and aggregated by third parties into a permanent public record. Your record. Having your private life exposed for others to see was once something only celebrities worried about. But in an era where everyone is online, everyone is a public figure. To keep my data private when I go online, I turn to ExpressVPN. Do you know there are hundreds of data brokers out there whose sole business is to buy and sell our data? The worst part is you don't know what they're doing, you don't get to have your say. That's why I use ExpressVPN. Just hit one button and then your internet connection gets rerouted through an encrypted server. No one can see your IP address. You're completely in your own private internet. Every time I turn ExpressVPN on, I'm given a random IP address shared by other ExpressVPN customers. That makes it harder for third parties to track me and harvest my data. No matter what device you're on, you just hit one button and you get your own protected connection. So if, like me, you believe that your data is your business, secure yourself with the #1 rated VPN on the market. Visit expressvpn.com/yang and get 3 extra months for free. That's expressvpn.com/yang. Go to expressvpn.com/yang to learn more. I want to dig in a little bit to this reality you project 8 years from now when these drugs fall off patent and become generics. And then you imagine you're going to see millions, even tens of millions of Americans taking an Ozempic or Ozempic-like pill, the generic version, every day. I mean, 8 years is going to fly by because, like this thing, it hit my radar last year sometime. I'm like, interesting. And then I got to be honest, Johann, I thought to myself, they'll find out it does some fucked up shit. I was like, oh, let me just wait and see whether, they find the growing horns or whatever.
I'm going to make sure you get an invite to my funeral in 2 years where you get to gloat over my grave. Exactly.
But 8 years will be here before we know it.
Yeah, and one of the things I'm fascinated by is what that will do to the economy and the culture. Barclays Bank commissioned a very sober-minded financial analyst called Emily Field to go away and just look at, how these drugs should affect their investment decisions going forward. She came back and said, if you want a comparison for what these drugs are going to do, you've got to look at the invention of the smartphone, right? Now, this is me talking, not her, but if we were to go back to the day Steve Jobs unveiled the smartphone in 2007, we would not have been able to game out TikTok and Trump and DoorDash
Sure.
and all these things that have transformed our lives. But I think we can begin to see all sorts of changes. I mean, look at Krispy Kreme stock is down, right? Nestle CEO Mark Schneider making very nervous noises about their confectionery and ice cream. But I think the more interesting stuff is things like Jefferies Financial just did a report for the US airlines saying you guys need to get ready to spend a lot less money on jet fuel because the population's about to get a lot thinner and it's going to cost a lot less to fly them. There's all these strange, unpredictable effects. There's been a huge run on jewelers in Los Angeles because people's fingers are shrinking so much their wedding rings don't fit them anymore. They've got to get them refitted. But to me, the book is called Magic Pill because there's three ways in which these drugs could be magic. The first way is the most obvious. They could just solve the problem, right? And I've got to tell you, Andrew, there are days it feels like that. My whole life I've overeaten junk food, and now once a week I inject myself in the leg and I don't want to eat it anymore. It's mind blowing, right? It feels like magic. The second way it could be magic is the dark way that you allude to. It could be like a magic, it could be like a conjurer who shows you a magic trick while picking your pocket. It could be that it gives us this benefit while screwing us over in some deeper way. I do not rule that out. The third way is actually the one that I think is most likely. If you think about the stories about magic that we grew up with, think about Aladdin, right? You find the lamp, you rub it, the genie appears, you get to make your wish, and your wish comes true, but never quite in the way you expected, right? All sorts of strange things that you didn't anticipate at the start begin to play out. I think we're already seeing some of that. I'm very worried about eating disorders, for example. Um, I'm very worried about what this will do to young women, seeing so many other women around them shrink. We already had exceptionally high levels of eating disorders at the start of the pandemic, and then it rose during the pandemic. There's all sorts of worrying, unpredictable effects. But if you want to know the positive benefits as well, I think look at the way the markets are reacting. There's a company that makes hinge joints for knee and hip replacements. Their stock is right down because fewer people are going to need knee and hip replacements because the major driver of that is obesity, right? So again, it's a very complicated picture.
And it sounds fairly positive. I mean, if you have fewer people who need new hips because you have fewer people who are morbidly obese or falling who can't get up. Comparing it to the smartphone is very powerful because I remember when the first iPhone came out and you had a sense it's like, wow, this is going to change a lot of things, but then you underestimate it over time. And I will say one reason why I'm grateful that you wrote this book and now we're having this conversation is I underestimated this
Interesting.
categorically. And I'm probably still underestimating it, even though you paint the picture of tens of millions of Americans taking this in 8 short years.
Well, I think one of the reasons we underestimate it is that these drugs are the biggest killer in the United States by many measures. Professor Gerald Mand, who designed the food label that's on all food in the United States, has calculated that 678,000 Americans die every year as a result of obesity and food caused illnesses, right? Staggering. That's more than all the soldiers who died in all the wars of the 20th century in the United States. Um, Staggering level of death. We don't think of it that way. We don't think, oh, your Uncle Bob, who had a heart attack when he was 63, was killed by obesity, or your aunt who got cancer, breast cancer at
Yeah,
42, was
that,
killed.
that's just something that happens. You don't think obesity, but obesity probably led to it happening then instead of 15 years later.
Exactly. Obesity is the underlying driver of so much death in the society and the culture. Um, but I'm conscious that I feel that we're giving a very positive depiction of these drugs, and I passionately believe all the positive elements we're talking about. But I want to talk about some of the negatives as well, because there are some things that are
Please.
very, very alarming. So I go through 12 big risks in the book, but I'll give you an example of one that worries me. So we mentioned before, a lot of the belief in the safety of these drugs is based on looking at the diabetics who take them. So some scientists said, okay, if that's our basis, let's really dig into the data on the diabetics. So there's a brilliant scientist in France called Professor Jean-Luc Fahy, who's a professor at Montpellier Hospital University in France. And he was commissioned by the French Medicines Agency to research these drugs, see how safe they are for the French market. So he started to look at the evidence, and he was particularly alarmed by one thing. When you look at the preclinical research, which is on animals, what you see is when you give these drugs to rats, their thyroid cancer risk massively increases. Worrying. And there's a plausible causation mechanism here. You don't just have GLP-1 receptors in your gut and in your brain, you also have them in your thyroid. So it kind of makes sense intuitively. If you're
Yeah,
screwing
that'll
with
do it.
GLP-1,
Sure.
you might be screwing with the thyroid. So he looked at an enormous database of diabetics in France. They have extremely good medical databases in France because they don't have the equivalent of HIPAA. You can't opt out. We should do that, by the way. It hugely boosts medical research. I know it's controversial, but I believe it. So he looked at a database of diabetics, thousands of them, who were taking these drugs between, I think it was 2006 and 2016, and compared them to a very similar group of diabetics who did not take these drugs. And he and his colleagues calculated that these drugs make you 50 to 75% more likely to develop thyroid cancer. Now, it's important to understand what that doesn't mean. It doesn't mean if you take these drugs, you have a 50 to 75% chance of getting thyroid cancer. If that was
It
the
means a
case,
relatively small chance went up significantly, very significantly.
exactly. And it's relatively small. It's not tiny. 1.2% of people get thyroid cancer in their lifetime. So that risk, if you were one of that 1.2%, obviously increases by 50 to 75% if Professor Faye is right and other people dispute this research. So again, if you go look at the warnings around earlier diet drugs, they usually began this way. A small effect is noticed. It was a small number of doctors in Fargo in North Dakota who noticed, loads of our patients seem to be having trouble breathing when they take this drug, that raised the safety signal that led to the deeper research. So there's a few kind of flashing red lights. I mean, another one that really worries me is if you look at pregnancy, we really know almost nothing about what happened. Obviously, you're advised to not take these. In fact, you're strongly told not to take these drugs when you're pregnant. But obviously, people often don't know they're pregnant, so they're taking the drugs in the early stages.
Or
And
they might take them anyway, honestly. I mean, we all know that.
yeah, exactly. And which would be very, very ill advised. And again, Dr. Stammer, who I mentioned before, raised to me and he stressed he does not think this is likely, but he said responsible scientists do have to warn about it. Um, he said, look at the evidence around mothers who are exposed to contaminants, environmental contaminants during pregnancy. Think about lead contaminants, which obviously we know a lot about because there's so much lead contamination in the United States still. So if you're exposed to lead during pregnancy, your baby is pretty much the same as everyone else's when they're born, right? It doesn't actually cause
Yeah.
overt birth deformities like the way that, say, thalidomide would have. But we know that when your kid gets to adolescence, your kid is significantly more likely to have attention problems, impaired
Yeah.
attitude to risk. So it seems to have affected the development of the reward system in the fetus's brain, which then emerges much further down the line. Obviously, you don't see that in a 2-day old, but you do
Yeah,
see
you
that as
wouldn't
they
know
get
that.
older.
Yeah.
Exactly. So he's concerned. Again, he stresses he doesn't think this is likely, but it is something we need to be vigilant to. There may be effects around that. Actually, I think a really basic drawback, which didn't happen to me, but I do think is really worth thinking about because I think it's very common. I think it's probably the biggest problem with the drugs is that lots of people just lose their pleasure in eating food. And eating is a very basic joy in life, right?
I'm Asian, man. Yeah. You take that away. The Asians will be like, I'm out.
Exactly. And I think, there's a brilliant food critic in Britain called Jay Rayner who wrote about, he started taking Ozempic. He would go to the best Michelin starred restaurants in Paris and it was like looking at a block of wood, right? It was just nothing to
What?
him. And
That
to
would be
me,
pretty crazy.
weirdly, I had the opposite effect, but I think for a kind of, I'm definitely an outlier. So for me, I went for dinner with a friend of mine not long after I started, well, maybe 3 months after I started taking the drugs. And she said to me, it's always been kind of weird going out to eat with you because you eat so much so quickly, but you never seem to enjoy it, right? You just kind of inhale it. And and she said, but now you're eating so much more slowly. You do actually seem to be enjoying your food. And I
Wow.
realized for me, very little of the pleasure I ever got from food before Ozempic was from the taste and texture of the food. It wasn't nothing, but it was very little. Most of the pleasure I got was from a feeling of stuffing myself. I think it went right back to my early childhood. And because you can't stuff yourself on Ozempic, you literally can't. Like if I tried to, I would, like I said before, I would throw up. Actually, I am eating better. And having gone to Japan to research how did they avoid this entire fucking dilemma? How did they get rich, third richest country in the world, without getting fat? And the answer is a bit strange, but totally fascinating. Since then, I eat loads of Japanese food. Now, I appreciate that's a luxury, not everyone can afford that. But yeah, and Japanese food boosts your satiety, and the flavor. It's not like Japanese people are depriving themselves. Japanese food is the most delicious food in the
Yeah,
world, right?
God, no.
It's like, oh
By the way,
no, I'm going to have to eat Japanese food from now on, right?
I mean, by the way, the exchange rate's really good right now too. So you're like,
Exactly.
wait a minute, this stuff's actually not that expensive right now.
Exactly. I cannot. Anyone listening who has not gone to Japan, I like literally thump the table. Go to Japan. What an incredible and fascinating country.
If you like Japanese food at all, you owe it to yourself to get to Japan because like
100%.
they're like you can't eat I couldn't eat Japanese food in America for at least a month afterwards because it just seemed like a drab imitation of what I'd had when I was there.
If you go, this is not an exaggeration. If you go to a gas station in Japan, that would be the equivalent of where you get those, those like sausages that are like roasted round and round in the US at a
Sure.
7-Eleven, and you order sushi in that gas station, it's more like Nobu than it is like anything you would get in the United States. And it's like a $4 gas station sushi.
It's so true. It's so crazy.
Yeah.
The first time you do it, you're just like, I'm just gonna get this random convenience store sushi, and then, and then you're like, this is amazing. And then when you then when you go and get higher end stuff, it's like nothing that you've ever had before.
It's so true. It's so true.
Well, Johan, so for people listening to this, let me say again, like I would not be a consumer of these drugs myself, but it's because of my own health profile. Again, I mean, it's like I don't have any obesity related family illnesses, but I have a feeling that there are going to be a lot of people who are in your situation, Johan, and your book is a great way for them to understand truly the choices that they're making, the choices that are going to be available to them and their children. Congratulations on being ahead of the curve again, really, because I looked at this again, I was like, holy crap. Like, this something I was like coming around. And then all of a sudden, here's I'm going to call it a word, authoritative inventory of the issues around these drugs. Magic pill, the extraordinary benefits and disturbing risks of the new weight loss drugs. They're going to change a lot of things around us. And I think this book's going to actually inform tons of people about how to approach what could be a life-changing decision.
Oh, thanks, Andrew. It means a lot to me coming from you. Thank you.
Oh, it's true, man. Keep up the great work.
Oh, cheers. Thank you.
I'll see you in Japan.
Oh my God. Let's meet in the Shibuya crossing. We are going to eat a lot of sushi. Yes.
Yeah, I feel
days.
great about it. And then stop. Because
actually, I will eat a modest amount because of my Ozempic, but nonetheless, you can pig out and I'll
eat more than you. Sure.